Hello and welcome to the Jefferson Educational Society's digital programming. I'm Ben Speggen and I'm the Vice President at the Jefferson and am a contributing editor at the Erie Reader. Joining me in conversation here today are Paula Jensen and Mike Knutson of Dakota Resources, a 501c3 community development financial institution with the mission of connecting capacity and capital to empower rural communities. Paula has a passion for community leadership and development, which drives her personal and professional life. She serves as the Vice President of Advancement with Dakota Resources based in Renner, South Dakota. Her roles with Dakota Resources include resource development and community coaching. She earned her Bachelor's of Science degree in accounting from Northern State University and is also a proud graduate and board member of the Leadership South Dakota. She resides in her hometown of Langford, South Dakota, population 318 plus, which we'll come back to later, where she and her husband have owned and operated an auto repair business for the past 27 years. Together, they are raising 3 boys who love living rural. Fun fact, she was the first woman to serve on her community's city council in 113 years and is still the only woman to ever serve in that leadership capacity. Mike currently serves as the network orchestrator and community coach for Dakota Resources. In his work, he tries to help connect rural change makers as they work to build thriving rural communities. He previously developed single-family housing and served as a rural school educator. How are mindsets shifting about the rural narrative in the 21st century? What is the heartland doing when it comes to brain gain and talent attraction? In this program, we'll discuss that, and we will talk about why networking matters and how the COVID-19 crisis has impacted the future of rural America. Since this program is first airing live on the Jefferson's Facebook page, we'll work our way through as many questions from you, the viewers, as we can as we host this event. If you do have a question, just leave it in the comments section below. If you're watching this broadcast at a later date, please do feel free to send us questions, and we'll do our best to get them along to Paula and Mike. And for more information on upcoming Jefferson Educational Society programs and publications, please do visit www.jeserie.org and like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter and Instagram. Paula and Mike, welcome to the Jefferson.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, looking forward to it.
So here we are on Cinco de Mayo, so I want to start with a tough question. What's the better rim for a margarita, salt or sugar?
I say salt.
What's a margarita? That might be my question.
So
I'm a beer guy, so I don't know.
You're asking that because you're a home brewer, right?
Well, yeah, right. I have had a beer margarita, and that's pretty good.
So Paula, I'm in your camp. I think salt is the right answer, but I'm also in Mike's camp because I think when given a choice between a margarita or a beer, I'm going to take the cerveza on Cinco de Mayo. But thanks for taking the time to join us here at the Jefferson digitally to talk about the work that you're doing with Dakota Resources. And of course, I want to say a big thanks to James and Deborah Fallows for actually connecting us all in conversation and getting to know each other. And as soon as I had the chance to talk to the two of you and learn about what you're doing, I wanted to bring you to the Jefferson and have you discuss that with our audience. So here we are today. And so I want to start with, tell us a bit about Dakota Resources, particularly what it is. What does the CDFI mean for you? And when it got started and why it got started.
Okay, so Dakota Resources started back in 1996 as kind of an earmark. Tom Daschle was our senator at that time and a majority leader. And there were financial institutions in South Dakota that wanted to get capital out into the rural communities. So we sometimes say it kind of started as the United Way for rural economic development. And a bunch of investors came together with a little bit of an earmark from the federal government, and they became a certified community development financial institution in 1998 with about $5 million in capital in the early 2000s to lend to, so we're an intermediary lender, which makes us a little bit different than a normal CDFI. So we lend dollars to the local economic development corp or other CDFIs, and then they kind of loan it out, relend it to local business, local homeowners, that kind of thing. So we've grown that fund to about 25 million. The last 5 years has really where we've seen the majority of our growth, lending to those communities. But along the way, we discovered that these communities also need some capacity building. And that's kind of where Mike and I work, is in the capacity building piece. And we have a few programs that we work in there around, like Rural X is our annual conference that brings people together from the greater upper Midwest region. We have Empower Community Coaching. We have a learning network. We also have a New Markets Tax Credit organization that we assist rural communities across the nation with larger projects as well. But that all leads to those communities developing individual leadership capacity, organizational capacity, and financial capacity, which ultimately we just want them to thrive. And that's where we go. Mike, what do you have to share about the programs?
Yeah, well, maybe I'd have a question of Ben first. Are CDFIs things that you're familiar with in your area?
So I think that some of our audience would be familiar with that, but
Yeah.
I think your model is something unique. You know, like you said, the fact that you're lending out to other CDFIs. So that's what makes this a really interesting conversation. And I don't want to just gloss over, Paula, that growth that you've had from the start to where you are now. So I do want you to go back on that. But Mike, tell us a little bit about the programs that are happening there.
Well, I just kind of make this connection that oftentimes CDFIs who are working with businesses are building the capacity of the business by lending money to them, but also by building their capacity to run their business. And in a way, that's what we're doing with our capacity building programs, only our focus is more on the community. So the Empower Community Coaching Program that Paula just described, it's really built on that concept of community engagement and also coaching. So we'll try to bring the whole community together. We may have a town of under 1,000 people, and we'll try to get a core team, small group of people to try and bring the whole community together. There may be 200 people that'll show up at a meeting and spend 3 hours talking about their future. And then as a part of that, we invite them to say, what's really important? What are you challenged with? What do you want? And they'll form teams around those subjects. Could be childcare, could be workforce housing or job development or whatever is pressing to them. And then we coach those teams, because you're talking about volunteers. They may not know some of those connections and how to do some of that. So we help them see what other communities are doing.
Well, and that's what seems so interesting about what you're doing, is it goes beyond that financial aspect of just empowering a business by providing money, but really providing that coaching, which I think has to greater ensure the success and growth of a particular business, rather than just saying, here's a pile of money, we wish you the best. Instead of that, networking them and working with them and coaching them along. That seems just fascinating to me, and that seems meaningful. Has that been the reason that you think you've experienced the growth you have from start to now? Because those are some powerful numbers in terms of how Dakota Resources has really grown.
So I think the capacity building is directly related to the capital investment fund growth. The communities that we're working with are developing so that they're able to access that capital. Some of them, we start out helping them learn how to build their balance sheet. Maybe they don't even have a balance sheet. So our capital credit officer goes in and works with that board of directors to say, okay, you need a balance sheet, you need a profit and loss statement, and we help them put it together, and we teach them how to use QuickBooks, and then we help them build that balance sheet so that they can borrow those dollars to do the projects that aren't getting done in their communities. So we underwrite the organization, not the project. Our average loan is about $650,000, and they're using those dollars for things like infrastructure and housing developments, or building housing in some cases, or creating a revolving loan fund to help small businesses. Mike?
So Mike, one of the things that you talked about was the size. So give us a sense of Dakota Resources' footprint But then you mentioned you're working with communities with, fewer than 1,000 people living there. Give us the top end. I've got to assume that that's probably the Sioux Falls region when it comes to that, but give us a sense of the size of the footprint. And then it sounds like you're working with a lot of diverse communities when it comes to the population size, the makeup, and the needs.
Yeah, so we work in all communities in South Dakota except those of Sioux Falls and Rapid City. Sioux Falls is our largest. They have about 170,000 probably now, and Rapid City is maybe around 70, 80,000, and somewhere in that range probably. But we'll work in any other community, both in our lending and in our capacity building programs. So we lend probably more to the mid-sized communities. And for us, that means communities that are often around 25,000 to 15,000. We've got about 15 of those in South Dakota. And it's often easier for them to take advantage of the money to get the loans because they have a more formal structure. They've been doing it longer. They have more money that they invest in. So we work with them, but we're also trying hard to build the capacity of smaller entities as well, and in smaller communities. So a lot of those are under 3,000. And that's just all over the place from the far northeast, northwest, down to all four corners.
So, and then speaking of smaller, Paula, in your bio there, you sent me over that the town you live in is 318 plus. You included that plus. You've got to tell me about that.
Yeah, so the rural narrative says that small towns are dying, right? So I live in a county of about 5,000 people. My small town is 318 plus because we're growing, right? We still have a K through 12 school that has a 225 kid census, which is pretty good for a town of 300. And in South Dakota, 95% of our towns are less than 5,000 people. So that's the bulk of the communities that we're focused on.
And so when you say the narrative of rural America is that it's dying out, what's your reaction, just gut reaction to that briefly, both of you? Mike, I'll start with you. When you hear the narrative, rural America is dying out.
Yeah, so, my gut is that everybody controls their own destiny, and too often we're putting the label on people. And the reality is most of our small towns in South Dakota have lost population since the 1920s. That's reality. Most have. It's not every town. And you look at Langford, South Dakota, where Paula lives, there's no inherent geographic or economic reason that they're maintaining their population and to a degree thriving, right? There's something else happening there. The people of that place are what are happening. And in our work, we often talk about the communities that are really thriving are those that invest in themselves. That could be money. It could be also their time, energy, and things like that. But also those that have that sustained leadership. Because too often we get started, we get going, and it's a stop and start. And I think that communities definitely control their own future.
Paula, Mike just mentioned leadership. You're on leadership. I noted in your intro too that you're the first woman to serve on your community city council in 113 years. Is it an election year for you? We've got to know that first.
No. So I was 32 years old and a mother of two when I decided it's time for me to be on the city council. So I got on the city council and I served for about 5 years. It was a great experience. And, at that time, there were two older gentlemen about the age of my dad that served on the city council, and they were great mentors for me through that. And I know they thought I was crazy a lot of times and things I wanted to do, but they stood behind me and they supported me to try those things. And fortunately, I didn't fail too many times, so they didn't have to say, I told you so. But I learned a lot. It was a great lesson, and it launched me into the love of leadership and the passion for developing leadership in these small communities.
And so I want to ask you just one more thing on leadership, and then I want to ask you both how you found your way to Dakota Resources. But again, with you, Paula, you mentioned that you were a member of and now the board of Leadership South Dakota. So just give us a word on that, and then I want to talk to you about what really drew you to Dakota Resources, both of you professionally.
Okay, so Leadership South Dakota is in their 6th class. A lot of states in the nation have a state leadership program. Leadership South Dakota has now graduated about 240 alumni. So they take 40 people each year from across the state of South Dakota and help them network with each other and to see places they never would see otherwise. And I am honored to be kind of the rural voice on that board of directors to bring that back to my communities.
It sounds like a really great initiative, and if you share a link with me, we'll make sure it gets to folks in the comment section of this post and when we post it again on our YouTube channel. So both of you seem incredibly passionate about Dakota Resources and being there. How'd you both land in the positions you are, and why are you excited to still be there, and why do you want to be there?
Maybe I'll jump in first, Paula. Yeah. So I guess the first thing is I never expected to be in a rural community or wanted to be in a rural community. I graduated from college to be a teacher. I saw myself going off to bigger, larger schools, being a teacher and coach in those places. And I really wasn't interested in being engaged in the small town where I was at. So what ended up happening is a group of students in another class challenged the whole community to a buy local campaign. They said, if you just spend 10% more locally, it's going to have a big impact because of this multiplier effect. And I was a young teacher. I wanted to support them. So I tried a little bit more to buy more things in the community. And it was just amazing. The next year, our local sales tax revenues grew over 30%. And it was like, oh, crap, I'm part of the problem, right? That little thing about just trying to do a little more in your community actually makes an impact. And that just got me going in the community, getting me engaged, involved. When we created a position as the economic development director where I applied, I got the job. And that was sort of my transition into community and economic development and out of teaching, but I always think that there's this connection between those two, and that's another passion of mine. Maybe the last thing I'd share, though, in terms of how my message out of this is the cavalry's not coming to our small towns, and we really have some things that we need to address ourselves and take on that responsibility.
Paula, for you.
Yeah, so I talked about, serving on my city council and how that launched me into leadership. So I moved back home to my hometown. My husband and I did after we were married, and opened a business, and my family farm is here, and I just always was passionate, and I never felt like I had to leave. Right? They never made me feel that way. So I was passionate about my own hometown, and I started creating things and writing grants and developing programs and projects in my community, that kind of thing. And one of the local nonprofits called Grow South Dakota reached out to me and said, we see you're writing grants and doing things like that. Do you want a job doing that? Because at the time I was a stay-at-home mom with my 3 boys. And I thought, well, I'm not trained in that, but I went to work for them, and I became their grant writer and did that. And then while I was employed there, I had an opportunity to work side by side with Dakota Resources in one of their community engagement processes. And I felt like this is what I need to do. I love this, being in community work. So I've been there for about 5 years with Dakota Resources. So.
Well, what's striking, I think, is that both of you had different career paths before this and found ways to apply that and are passionate about it. And I think that speaks to the care that, we tend to carry in our hearts for the places we live and the places we want to change. And that's just really totally inspiring, and not to shift to take it to a darker note, but I've got to ask, for both of you, the places you're in right now, and then I'll ask more broadly for South Dakota, what's the impact of COVID-19 been like for you so far?
So I'm a remote worker. I live 3 hours from the Dakota Resources office, so working remotely is not difficult for me. In my community, people are staying home. Churches have gone online. The school went online right away. People are being cautious. A couple businesses, the restaurant opened back up last week, but that's even going carefully.
Mike, for you, where you're at, what's the situation with COVID-19 right now?
Yeah, Paul and I were talking about this just earlier today. I live in Watertown, South Dakota, community of about 24,000. That's a big city in South Dakota, right? I don't know what's going on in Watertown all that much, to be honest. In part because I'm connecting daily with people around South Dakota and outside of South Dakota. I'm a remote worker as well, and I connect more right now with people in other places than I probably have at any other point, and less in town because I live right on the edge of town. And the reality is I don't think our newspaper is doing a great job of communicating the rest of it. So yeah, it's a little bit isolated in that regard. But here's one thing I think that's interesting. We're a state that is heavily dependent at the state level on sales tax. That's our revenue for the state, and that's plummeting. People aren't coming, people aren't spending the money for the most part, and that's going to be a huge challenge. In some of our smaller towns, though, they've talked about how the grocery store and the hardware store, they may be two of the more prominent businesses in town. They're actually busier than they've ever been. And it's in part because people aren't going to the Walmarts of the world. They're not driving 20 miles to the next town to the Walmart or wherever. They're buying locally. And I think that that's making an impact. It'll be interesting to see how those dollars kind of play out.
Yeah, it'd be fascinating to follow that and the impact in communities like yours to see the return to local. I know, we're seeing local step up here in Erie, Pennsylvania, and restaurants pivot and find ways to get meals out. And, we're seeing nationwide how restaurants are shifting to also be quasi CSAs, where they're trying to connect local farmers, who don't have to waste their harvest or crops now, in a way to get that through a restaurant. So, what an interesting time to be in. And, I think South Dakota is a great place to check in on. So we'd love to continue to follow that story and how that's happening for you. Both of you mentioned, Mike, you're going to jump back in before I go to the next one.
I want to share one other thing here about this, though. In some ways, South Dakota maybe received a little bit of ridicule nationally because we didn't have an official shutdown in the state. And there was some real wrestling with what's the proper response in the state. And I don't know that I know the correct answer for that. But what I do know is that for the most part, people tried hard to do sheltering in place and tried to minimize contact. And I think that paid dividends. So in South Dakota right now, as a state, I don't even know the total number in the state, but Sioux Falls, they have over 2,000 cases of COVID-19. The county that I live in, we've had 15. Our next largest city, the second largest city is Rapid City. In their county, they've had 14 cases. Yeah. We have 16 counties that haven't had a reported case yet. So this is, I'm afraid that people are going to get too lax and jump back in right away. And so it's just one of those dances, I think, that we've just got to be careful about, and let's not do it too fast. Let's be smart about it.
Well, I think you're absolutely right there, Mike. And I think, for folks maybe not terribly familiar with South Dakota or thinking about South Dakota, maybe the only thing that they had been thinking about in terms of COVID-19 in South Dakota is certainly thinking about the Smithfield plant in Sioux Falls and the outbreak there. Shine a little bit of light on that, because it seems like what I'm hearing from both of you is that locally in your towns, the response has been smart, measured, and you're working your way back in as smoothly as you possibly can. But nationally, most folks are probably just hearing about the Smithfield plant. So Give us some reporting from the ground there.
Yeah, so that hit our staff personally. One of our accounting staff is married to a gentleman that worked at Smithfield. And so it has affected us personally and affected the Sioux Falls community, I think, in a big way, in the supply chain. So I'll talk about it from my perspective of my own region and my own community. Is we have Hutterite colonies in my part of the state, and every day one semi-load of hogs goes around the corner in front of my husband's business to Smithfield Foods in Sioux Falls. Well, it's been a little over 2 weeks that they've been shut down. There's no market for those hogs. They were taking them to Sioux City, but now most of those other meat packing plants are also shutting down, right? So that's a local perspective. How is it affecting our egg producers, as well as the supply chain?
Well, I think that's something that, if anything, this crisis has really shined a light on and helped us to understand is the complexity of supply chain when it comes to where we get what we get and how we get it. So I think you're spot on there. Mike, anything to add in terms of, the Smithfield plant in Sioux Falls and what you can share with us?
Well, I think I just dive in and say that it shows us kind of sort of the weakness in our current system, and that there's some real issues that we're becoming more aware of. And I think as community and economic development professionals in South Dakota, we've been lax about this. We had one of our ED pros recently share that she's been working with cattle producers in her community. They're struggling. They're losing $200 a head on each cattle that they produce. They lose $200. Now, the estimate suggests that cattle, the meat processing facilities are earning $800 per head, right? And so there's this disparity that's going on. And, 80%, I think it's 80% of the meat processing is being done in 4 facilities or 4 companies. That's how tightly constrained the process is, and it's all about just getting big and controlling the market. There's not a fair market for meat prices for cattle producers out there, and I think that's going to come an increasing issue over the next few months, year, and hopefully we shine some more light on that.
Yeah, I can't help but think at the same time that we're hearing national stories about meat shortages, that our grocery stores are going to be short on their supplies. The shelves are going to be a little more bare than we'd like to see them. So certainly something we'll follow along. I want to circle back to both of you mentioned, you're remote workers. And so you've been doing what many of us are now doing because of the crisis, pre-crisis. Tips and tricks that you have, things that you think can be helpful for those who are now working remotely, who weren't prior, but now find themselves in this situation because you two are pros at it.
We use Zoom, on a daily basis in our lives, right? And I don't know that I think you have to get up and get dressed every day, just like you were going to work, and you show up on screen and, you prioritize your time and you set your schedule. And I'd say sometimes when I started doing the downfall was that I'd catch myself working at, 10 at night because my work was here. There. Mm-hmm. So it's good for people who are workaholics. Like Mike and I, but it allows me flexibility for my life. And thank goodness I don't have small children right now, because I really respect those people that are trying to homeschool their kids and work remotely. I don't know how they do it.
I think that's another light that the crisis has really shined is what it takes to raise a family and what it takes to educate children. And when that shifts into a space that perhaps we weren't ready for it to shift to, certainly our thoughts are with the teachers, our thoughts are with the parents, our thoughts are, with the entire family. That's no easy task. Anything quickly from you, Mike, because I want to jump on to internet for South Dakota.
I would share that I didn't come to work for Dakota Resources until I was convinced that they would make it friendly for me to be a remote worker. And I think that there's things that bosses can do in this process of working remotely. Number one, it's not like treat the in staff as they're the golden children and they get all the attention. We have to treat everybody equally in this process so that we have full conversations, because it's so much easier to have that water cooler conversation, and that's where the decisions get made. And we're missing out on some of those types of things if that's the atmosphere and the culture that we allow to thrive. So we work hard at hosting meetings and doing it, I think, well online. And that has, ultimately, we think we don't even notice it, but it makes a difference in this COVID environment.
Well, I'd say I'd like to task both of you with putting together a tutorial of how to do that and send it out nationwide so we can all learn from you. That's a different conversation for a different day. One of the things that I think might surprise folks is just the bandwidth in South Dakota. The fact that 96% of the population has access to broadband technology. We all know that Zoom calls occasionally fail, live streams lag, things do happen, but it seems like South Dakota is fairly well connected. Tell us a little bit about the infrastructure there in South Dakota.
So I'd say a lot of that credit goes to our rural telecom cooperatives, right? So in rural places, cooperatives are what make things go, whether it's a local grain elevator, the local telephone company. And a lot of those telephone companies that have been around for a long time really jumped on the opportunity back in the 90s to get us all connected to internet, to the outside world. And South Dakota is wired pretty well. I have a map. Can I share that on my screen?
I can.
That works. So.
Let me, folks, we are learning in the process. Paula, I'm going to go ahead and make you a co-host and you can share your screen.
Okay.
All right, so Paula, you can work to pull that up. While she's getting that, Mike, we do know occasionally the power goes out and things don't work, so.
Yeah, you mentioned that you wanted to talk about this subject, and then just yesterday I had a problem. Our electricity went out in the town, and it was a short thing, but I got cut off on a Zoom call. And then today I lost internet for about 30 minutes with something. I don't know what happened. So it does happen, right? But pretty good pipes in South Dakota, as this map hopefully shows.
I was going to say cover more than 76% there. So Paula, tell us what we're looking at.
So this is the rural telecoms that created SDN, which is a South Dakota network of cooperatives that came together to, wire rural places. So we have egg producers in really remote places that have broadband wired directly to their house, right? Or they're out there in their, self-driving tractor, gleaning off of some of that Wi-Fi and satellite type access that they need. But Mike, back in the late 90s, was part of the conversation to get our schools wired. So in 1997, because of some of this infrastructure that was going into place, those schools were all hardwired. Mike, maybe you want to tell that story.
Yeah, I mean, I think just the point here is that back in the 90s, I can't even remember the time period, the governor at the time said we're going to wire schools. By wiring, I mean actually putting in the infrastructure in the schools so we could have it in the classrooms. And they helped us all then as teachers go through the process of learning how to use computers in the classroom. And I think that we did a pretty decent job of that. We need to do better yet today, though, in terms of using technology efficiently in the classroom as well as even in our businesses.
Well, I think that's another one of the lights that the crisis is shining is just the number one, the digital divide between those who have access and can afford access, and then those who can tap in and those who can, all dependent on place. And then I think too, how much education can move into a digital arena and how much we can do there in terms of that. Paula, thanks for sharing that. Send me that link as well. We'll make sure we include that with the programs there. One with all this talk about, the excitement of South Dakota and Mike, earlier you mentioned, people wanting to be there, wanting to be in these towns, and that's something that draws the people in. I want to talk for a minute about brain gain and talent attraction, because to both of you, I've heard you both speak about Ben Winchester or Winster in terms of brain gain and talent attraction. Tell us why that's an important thing to you.
Yeah, so a little background here. Ben and I met over a decade ago when I was publishing a blog called Reimagine Rural. And our goal really at that time was to share with community leaders that they need to think about transforming their economy rather than just trying to revitalize it, because there's always this talk about how we want to be what we once were, and that's not gonna happen. And so we were writing about entrepreneurship, innovation, and why do people move to a community? Why do they live where they live? And then the question emerged, what attracts people? And that's where I first met Ben, because he was writing, he was doing research about why people were moving to communities in West Central Minnesota. The assumption was it's really about the job. If you just get more jobs, that's what community and economic development is about. More jobs, better jobs, all that stuff. But what he discovered is that what mattered most was people are moving there for a simpler way of life, lower housing costs, paying less in their on their mortgage each month, right? And then the last thing is safety and security. These are places that are good places to raise families. And it's like, oh, they're creating their jobs just to go to those places. And that was sort of an eye-opener, a shift for us to start to think differently about it. Now, a lot of people are still focused, like, we got to create jobs. And I don't want to minimize that either. It's not important. That's not my point. But it's not always the key driver of what helps our economies in rural places thrive. And so then when people, and this is just where that comment about brain gain comes in that you mentioned, we often assume that all of our young people are going to leave. Some communities will try to keep all their kids there. That's not going to work either. We want them to go out and get an education, but we shouldn't instill in them this attitude that they have to leave just to live a big life. And so Ben is saying, really, go get your education. The reality is when they come back, they're bringing an education and experience, and that's what we need in our small towns. So that's his framing around, let's tell the whole story. It's not just brain drain. We also have brain gain happening. Yeah, does that make sense?
It totally makes sense. And Paul, I'd ask for your take on that too, for what it means for you to have the brain gain or maybe the brain retain of you have somebody from the area, they go out and get the education, they bring it back, maybe boomerangers, in a sense of heading out and then returning back. What does that mean for you?
Yeah, so growing up in a small town, I would say the message from the adults a lot of times, and during the farm crisis years, were get out of here. Go somewhere to the big city and be successful. There's nothing here for you. I didn't hear that myself, but I know a lot of communities around me that was the general message, right? Get out of here.
Do you think that was generational? Do you think that that's changed now, that the message is different? Or the adults, saying something different now that you don't have to get out?
I think the message is changing. So a lot of our economic development professionals that we work with actually implement programs with their graduating seniors. And like, for instance, one community we have gives each of the graduating seniors a mailbox filled with letters and things from the business owners and the pastor and the teachers, right? That's their gift. But the real gift is the invitation to return back home. Leave here, go get your education, get some experience, but you can always come back home. And that's a message I've always given to my own 3 sons, is that you can go anywhere, but you're always welcome back home, and bring that experience with you and start your own business, right? So I think the message is shifting. And we have a lot of those, 30 to 45-year-olds that are coming back to the small towns with their families and establishing a place to be. My neighbor, Brandon, he left for a while, went to Minneapolis. He and his wife both got educated. He's an engineer, and he decided to come back. And he's an engineer now at a local manufacturing plant, and his wife is a nurse. And they moved their 3 kids back and built a new house about a block from me. And he's working with a school, and he started a robotics club, you know. So those are the kind of people that are coming back to our communities.
You know, and I would share that when I was teaching, the guidance counselors would take kids to career day in a bigger city and have them go see, what can you do for a job in this other place? In bigger city, I'm talking a community of 25,000, right? We didn't even try to connect them to all the opportunities that were available. And we have these shortages for what can be a good job in a community of, you can start your own business as a contractor, as a plumber. We have incredible shortages in these areas, but we haven't always helped them, young people, get into them or recognize those opportunities.
And one of the other ways that you're really exposing what it is that's happening in South Dakota, and I think on a broader scale for rural America, is what you mentioned earlier, Rural X, a conference dedicated for this. Obviously, under current circumstances, things have shifted a little bit, but tell us about Rural X and tell us what the plans are for right now for the conference this year, how you're pivoting around that.
Yep, so we're going to take Rural X virtual for 2 days on June 17th and 18th. So it'll be like from noon to 5 or 6 on the first day, and on the second day from about 8 to noon. And we have a couple keynote speakers lined up. One of them that I can mention today is Priya Parker. She's the author of The Art of Gathering, and it's about meeting and why it matters, and coming together. And she just started a new podcast as well, together. I can't remember the name right now, but so we'll gather together online for a couple days, and the tickets are available right now at ruralx.org. So you can go check that out, or anybody can sign up to get the e-news and watch kind of the latest speakers as they're launched.
So tell us about the name, though, Rural X. How did you come up with it, and why have a conference dedicated to rural? And then we'll talk about the art of gathering digitally and what gathering now means to a lot of us, as that definition is certainly shifting. But Rural X, the name, why have a conference dedicated to rural topics?
It's about the rural experience. But Mike,
Yeah,
you want to talk about why rural?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that so often we will go to an economic development or community development conference, and all the focus is driven towards the larger communities. And so then the thought process is, oh, let's take that idea and plant it in a small town. That doesn't scale that way always, right? We have to make it our own. And the reality is we have incredible talent in our small towns. And we haven't talked about our learning network really at all, but we've tried to connect that talent online through our online platform, through our webinars, and through our gatherings that are face-to-face, but we're constantly trying to learn from each other. And we want others like you, like other people who have different perspectives, to begin to help us shape what that future is, but we can't always be told this is how you need to do things. We're doing a disservice at Dakota Resources if we tell a community leader, this is how we think you should do something. And so let's just help them connect and learn from each other.
Well, and that's such a great way to move into, I do want to talk about the learning networks. And one of the things you're doing now, you know, amidst the crisis, are virtual coffee hours where you're learning from folks. You're hosting some happy hours. Tell us what that looks like in a non-COVID-19 sense, what learning networks look like to you then, and then tell us the role of the virtual coffee hours. And you've been hosting them darn near daily.
Yeah, so first I would share that we have used Zoom, I think, pretty effectively for 2 years within our learning network. And we get together regularly for webinars that are not intended to be one person standing and talking to everybody for an hour. We want somebody to talk for a while and then engage in a conversation about that subject where we can make it our own and make it something that's worthwhile in our own communities. And so that's one thing that we've done. And 4 times a year, we were trying to get together around a book. So this is our how we first came to Jim and Deb Fallows. We'd read the book, Our Towns, and we said, let's hold a book read about it, and let's just get together after hours and have a social. So the rule was you couldn't be in your office. You had to be somewhere else and grab your favorite beverage, whether that was coffee, water, or something else, right? And so that's what we did. Jumping back though, when COVID hit, we were also having this question around how can we create a virtual water cooler? How can we create serendipitous interactions between people periodically through the day? And that happened, that was sort of emerging prior to COVID. We don't know that we have the answer to that right now, but we just said, oh, our people have all these questions about how do you modify your loan policies in the face of businesses who can't make those payments? How are you dealing with your city council getting online and holding meetings on Zoom? All this stuff. So we just said, let's get together. Let's have a little social time. And it grew from a half hour with 10 people to now anywhere from 10 to 30 will join, and it's often an hour. Sometimes we have guests, sometimes it's just the folks who are there. So, but it's meeting a need for them, helping them maybe innovate as well.
So
what else would you share?
Yeah, Paula, what would you add? Because I think my follow-up to that is it seems like you two are working on perfecting or mastering the art of gathering and doing it digitally, that's what you're doing. So I was going to ask to both of you what you say to naysayers to say that you can't connect any other way, shoulder to shoulder. It seems like you're doing it, but Paula, add in your thoughts first, and then let's talk about the ability to connect when it doesn't have to be in person.
Yeah, so I think what we do differently in our learning network to help people connect virtually is to make it more conversational. So we want to make sure every time we get together that everybody's voice is heard. So we try to host in that manner, right? That people don't just sit there silent or unmute or shut off their video. We encourage them to have their video on. Let's see each other face to face and build connections and relationships that way. And we like to celebrate. So like virtual social hour, that's a time for us to come together and celebrate those things, because other times when we meet, we're trying to solve problems and sometimes they're kind of serious issues. So let's get together and celebrate once in a while and make that easy.
And I would throw in that face-to-face will never not be a part of our network. We firmly believe that we're going to meet at least 4 times a year, and we're going to build strong relationships, trust-based relationships, and really you need to be face-to-face at times to be doing that. But I want to just lift up that, there's really some pretty innovative stuff that's being done, and I'd encourage people to check out a book. It's getting kind of old, but it's called The Power of Pull. And it's really about how do you create these spaces where people are generating innovative ideas, and some of that can be done online.
So I love that you mentioned that book, because I was going to ask for some homework and some reading for people who are looking to do that at home that would be inspiring to them. Certainly that one. You already mentioned Our Towns, and I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that in fact Tom Hanks had read Our Towns, tweeted about it, and said he was thinking about visiting South Dakota at some point. Have y'all wrangled him in? Has he been there? Are you working on it? Have you reached out? Has he reached out? What's the Hanks update?
Yeah, I don't know. I guess I know the reason that I read about the book was because of the Tom Hanks tweet, right? The people in Sioux Falls went haywire. They were just crazy about that tweet. But I haven't followed up or paid attention since then, largely.
I think oftentimes South Dakota gets a lot of famous people that show up at Sturgis at the motorcycle rally, but we never hear about it because they keep a low profile.
So you two have been so gracious with your time, and I don't want to take too much more. So for key takeaways for folks tuning into this program or watching it at a later date, what do you most want them to take away about the work you're doing with Dakota Resources, or the things that you're just passionate about when it comes to the future of rural America and what you're working on?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that I would share is something we haven't talked a great deal about so far, but it's underlying everything that we do. And that's just the power of networks. How we interact today is different than how we interacted 20 years ago, and a network today is different. Network-based business models are so much better than the traditional business model, and there's a lot of reasons why. In rural places, we need to just ask, what is the underutilized talent? What's the underutilized asset that already exists, and how can we connect it? That's what we're trying to do with our learning network and much of what we do. And I think that the future is pretty bright when we utilize that approach for rural places.
Paula, for you.
Yeah, and you know, the message I want to carry forward is rural can thrive, and it is thriving in a lot of places. And it's people that make that work. And Mike mentioned it before, the cavalry's not coming. Nobody's going to come save us. So we have to work really hard to make our communities places people want to live. And I think there's a lot of opportunity in rural that if you just dig a little deeper, you'll find that there's lots to do and lots of opportunities in rural places. We're just not the flyover states, right? We're just not the place with wide open spaces with nothing in between. You know, there's food being grown there, and there's energy being produced there, and there's manufacturing being done in these little pockets, right? Like 3M in Aberdeen is making masks for the world right now. So there's lots of things happening in small towns, and you'd be remiss if you believed otherwise.
And I was just going to jump in and say, and there's talent being produced here. We have a great educational system, and we don't have to just export that talent. We can help continue to grow it and attract it and further it. And that's what helps me become excited.
Well, and it's certainly such an exciting thing. More than just a traditional CDFI, what you're doing with Dakota Resources, the coaching, the development, certainly we're seeing a lot of innovation there that I know we're going to continue to look to for years to come. Paula, Jensen, Mike Knutson of Dakota Resources, thank you both so much for taking the time to join us for this Jefferson program.
Thanks for having us, Ben.
And to all of you watching along at home, thank you for tuning in. To find out more about Dakota Resources, Paula and or Mike, where can folks go online to find your website, which is brand new, by the way, fantastic, awesome looking. Where do they go? DakotaResources.org. Excellent. To find out more about upcoming as well as past Jefferson events and publications, please do visit www.jeserie.org. And of course, like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter and Instagram. For the Jefferson Educational Society, I'm Ben Speggen. Be safe, be sound, and thanks for listening and learning with us today. Bye.